Welcome to this Science, Technology and Religion Unit roundtable session on Arthur Petersen's book, Climate, God and Uncertainty. Arthur writes in his introduction that his aim in the book is to formulate, in the context of dealing with climate change, a transcendental, naturalistic philosophy of culture that enables adequate reflection on uncertainty in science and religion. To pursue this task, Arthur draws on the work of William James, Bruno Latour and Heinrich Rickert. Their insights enable him to assess what climate change means for philosophy and to make a methodological intervention on the sort of naturalism that guides both Latour's work and a large part of the field of science and religion. In our session this evening, 5 panelists are going to scrutinize Arthur's transcendental naturalism and tell us and him what they think about it. First, we'll hear from Josh Reeves, Director of Science and Religion at Samford University, then from Bethany Solaretta, Lecturer in Science and Religion at the University of Edinburgh. After Bethany, we'll hear from Whitney Bauman, Professor of Religious Studies at Florida International University. After Whitney, Gijsbert van den Brink, Chair of Theology and Science at the Free University Amsterdam. And last but not least, we'll hear from Lisa Sedaris, Professor of Environmental Studies at UC Santa Barbara. Each of our panelists is going to speak for 8 to 10 minutes or so, and then Arthur, who is Professor of Science, Technology, and Public Policy at UCL, will reply with a 20-minute reflection.
In Climate, God, and Uncertainty, Petersen develops a sophisticated philosophical position called transcendental naturalism that extends Immanuel Kant's philosophy, as interpreted by Heinrich Rickert, into contemporary debates in the field of science religion. The term transcendental follows Kantian philosophy in referring to the a priori conditions that shape our understanding of the world. Petersen's philosophy is naturalist in that it focuses on what we can know and experience within the realm of observable reality, rather than speculating about a realm beyond our grasp. At the core of transcendental naturalism is the assertion that values such as truth, beauty, and justice have a real ontological status and should be considered part of nature. Petersen defines nature, building on Rickert's ideas, defines nature as including not only physical objects, but also these transcendental values, which exist, quote, on this side and guide human judgment. I deeply resonate with many goals of Petersen's project. His insistence on leaving room for mystery rightly acknowledges that scientific inquiry, while valuable, cannot capture the entirety of human experience. His criticism of scientific materialism as a philosophy to live by highlights its failure to account for human meaning-making, moral judgment, and engagement with the transcendent. His emphasis on expert judgment and intercultural dialogue on values in science has clearly been informed by his many years of experience on international climate change panels. The question I would like to focus in on this response is whether it's necessary to expand the concept of nature to best reach these philosophical conclusions. I worry that by incorporating transcendental values into the concept of nature, Petersen introduces a counterintuitive and idiosyncratic definition that does not align with scientific practice and everyday language use. I argue that we can reach many of these same conclusions with a more conventional understanding of nature. Traditionally, the concept of nature has been foundational to defining the character and limits of science. Pre-Socratic philosophers, in works often titled On Nature, sought to understand the underlying principles governing the natural world, proposing fundamental substances like water, air, or fire as its basic elements. Aristotle's philosophy of nature built upon this classical understanding by explaining how and why things exist and change through his doctrine of the 4 causes. What unites these views are the search for inherent principles of nature that govern the natural world. This search for natural principles that govern the world still motivates scientists today. As the philosopher of science James Woodward argues in his classic work, Making Things Happen, a distinctive feature of the sciences is the practice of causal inference and explanation. Scientists aim to uncover the fundamental laws and forces that govern the universe, seeking explanations that are consistent, testable, and independent of human perception. However, Petersen contends, and building on Latour, that this standard way of understanding and using the concept of nature leads to a harmful separation between humans and the rest of the world. If values and culture are considered external to nature, humans, as the creators and bearers of these values, will be perceived as disconnected from the natural world. This separation, Petersen argues, is a consequence of scientific naturalism, a perspective that prioritizes scientific knowledge and methods as the sole path for understanding reality. By expanding nature to encompass, quote, the world as a whole, Petersen aims to bridge this divide and foster a more integrated view of humanity's place in the natural order. I worry, however, about trying to solve problems through metaphysical proposals that don't line up with our everyday explanatory practices. Petersen's redefinition of nature relies upon a metaphysical claim about the ultimate nature of reality, since the ontological existence of values is not something that can be empirically verified. By expanding nature to cover values in natural objects, I worry we may undermine the methodological clarity that allows science to function effectively. It may also not be helpful in addressing environmental concerns because it moves debates towards abstract philosophical arguments rather than practical solutions. I believe that we can address the perceived separation between humans and the natural world without redefining the concept of nature. Humans can be viewed as part of nature in a biological and ecological sense, while also recognizing our capacity for culture, values, and meaning-making requires a different explanatory framework. This can be shown by thinking through two different alternatives in the literature that recognize the role of values in human judgment without resorting to transcendental philosophy. These alternatives focus more on psychology than metaphysics and ontology. The first is the classic account offered by Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn's concept of paradigms provides a useful way for understanding the way values shape our perception of the world. Kuhn argues that paradigms, comprehensive frameworks of theories and practices, influence what scientists observe and how they interpret their data. He says explicitly that the world we inhabit is an active construction by the mind's interpretive frameworks, rather than it merely being a passive mirroring of empirical data. Kuhn contends that scientific revolutions result in scientists inhabiting a different world, not because physical reality has changed, but because our conceptual structures have, emphasizing the theory-laden nature of observation and challenging the view of science as purely an objective endeavor progressing linearly towards the truth. The philosopher Roger Scruton offers another possibility, outlining a position he calls cognitive dualism. Scruton argues that human understanding involves two distinct yet intertwined perspectives: the scientific worldview, which seeks universal explanations, and the interpersonal worldview, which seeks meaning and purpose through understanding. This dualism addresses the limitations of the scientific method in capturing first-person experiences, such as identity, personal motivations, and moral accountability. While science describes the physical world and its causal laws, it cannot answer existential questions of who am I or why, which are central to subjective experience. Cognitive dualism suggests that human nature cannot be fully understood or captured by science alone, but requires an interpersonal perspective where subjective experiences and relational understanding are equally significant for understanding the world. This framework thus maintains a single reality approach through complementary but incommensurable ways of knowing. Both Kuhn and Scruton thus agree that while values are an inherent part of scientific judgment, they locate these values within human nature, a matter of human psychology, rather than in an expanded concept of nature itself. This more modest position leaves room for mystery without needing to redefine a foundational concept that guides scientific practice. The goal in the education of scientists thus would not be having them posit from the very beginning that values are real, but merely to recognize that values cannot be eliminated from our description of the world. Once that foundational piece is accepted, we can either debate whether values are ontologically real, or with respect to climate change, we can debate which values will inform our policy choices. So in conclusion, it seems like we have, I would argue, two options. Option one, the one taken by Petersen, is to expand the concept of nature significantly so that it encompasses all of culture and values. The second option, the one I have argued for in this paper, is much more limited in scope. It recognizes that nature is only one aspect of the world we experience. It says that natural principles govern the world, but that human culture and values operate within different explanatory frameworks and will always shape our perception of nature. I think the second option is more practical for addressing climate change. By maintaining a conventional understanding of nature and recognizing the role of human values within the appropriate domains, we preserve the methodological division of labor essential for scientific inquiry without resorting to contentious metaphysical redefinitions, ultimately fostering a more productive dialogue on how to address one of the most pressing issues of our time. Thank you.
So I work in the area of climate change and theology, particularly around the uncertainties that exist if climate change proves to be irreversible. So this book was of immediate interest to me. It did, however, take me outside of my usual comfortable bubble of contemporary eco-theologians and into a world I'm far less familiar with. The philosophy of William James in the late Victorian period, the work of Heinrich Rickert in the early 20th century, and the contemporary work of the late Bruno Latour. This book involves a deep dive into philosophical metaphysics across several centuries and across several intellectual traditions. And so if you are like me, that is not an area of experience or of expertise, this really does become a more challenging read. In a similar way, my own position as a Christian theologian meant that the emphasis of transcendent naturalism sits outside of my sort of most fluent worldview. And so together, it means that my reflections today on the book have something of the nature of an outsider looking in on a conversation with which I'm not particularly fluent. Now, uncertainty plays a key role in the reflections. Petersen explores the transition from modernist thought, where the world is machine-like and predictable, determinist, to the strands of 20th century thought that make absolute certainty impossible. So that could include quantum mechanics and the uncertainty around the basic nature of how the building blocks of our universe behave. But in this book, it revolves around the concept of Gaia, of James Lovelock's proposal that the entire planet should not be seen as a machine composed of smaller ecosystemic cogs, but rather as a living organism that has homeostatic tendencies. Basically, life itself is changing the Earth in such a way to make its own existence on the planet possible. And that implies two things. First, that the mechanistic models of modernism are an unsuitable way to approach climate change policy, which still, for the most part, treats the world in machine-like ways. And second, our planet provides a rich source of inexhaustible wonder for the human spirit, which can then create a guiding set of ethics and laws that will help guide human action. So in essence, I see the book as a call for policy and politics, which are often still stuck in mechanistic thinking. Petersen is, of course, expert in policy and politics, having himself been part of this Dutch delegation to the sessions of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so you have this call to undergo the same change we've seen happen in science. So if in science we've moved from Newton's universal laws to Heisenberg's uncertainty, from Paley's perfect design to Lovelock's emerging creativity of Gaia, and so on. So to take action when uncertainty is all we have is a key foundation of this book. How do we act in the midst of uncertainty? Now, one discussion that I would have liked to have heard more about is around the question of control. So for all the talk of uncertainty, there's actually very little on control, and I think it's an essential and largely missing concept in the book. So the attempt to control is so often the human response to uncertainty because it restores predictability and that sense of certainty we long for. But a focus on control also reveals something else, that perhaps our climate woes have nothing, or at least very little, to do with modernism or postmodernism. Perhaps nothing at all to do with our philosophy in the first place, and instead has to do with humans and their power. If you look at the history of life on Earth, you see that almost any time a life form becomes excessively powerful, climate woes follow. The first time was 2.5 billion years ago, when one form of life proliferated throughout the oceans in a world where there was little competition for resources. Their metabolism emitted a toxic gas, and they increased the percentage of this toxic gas in the atmosphere from 0 to 20%, until it was so high that it threatened the possibility of life on Earth altogether. The change of gases caused the climate to change, plummeting the Earth into the first global ice age, which could have been the end of life. However, luckily, as we can tell, life itself responded and found a form of life that could use that highly toxic gas in metabolism, the toxic gas being, of course, oxygen, as you all know. So, we could look at other periods like the end of the Permian, where you have a combination of volcanic activity and the metabolism of bacteria on nickel that was exposed, turning it into methane, and it spikes global temperatures to an average of 32 degrees Celsius, about 17 degrees higher than our global average today. But the point I'm trying to make is that life, by being itself, by flourishing, exceeds itself. A flourishing species naturally destroys the basis of its own flourishing due to its very success. Ecosystems do not find a harmony or balance, rather they flex between the predominance of different species over time. So there are certain norms that describe the boundaries of that ebb and flux of power, but static harmony is simply not a reality of nature. In this sense, Petersen's challenging a deterministic, machine-like approach to climate policy, which assumes there is such a thing as sustainability to be achieved, is, I think, right on the money. Yet, Petersen also suggests that wonder and poetics can lend a broader framework that would improve our policies. And I sort of agree, but I'm also a little bit skeptical here. If I'm right to think that life with power will always, by flourishing, destroy the conditions of its own success, then the particular metaphysic we hold is almost beside the point. Right? If you're facing a massive Canadian wildfire, there probably is a best handheld fire extinguisher you could use. There probably is some that are better, but I don't think either of them are up to the scope of the challenge. So I just came from this sort of ecology of religion unit where Bron Taylor was sort of lamenting the fact that religion hasn't been powerful enough to turn the scope of our environmental crisis. But here is what I think. If humans flourish, we will, by being flourishing life, destroy our environments. And again, I think that there is historical evidence of this. Long before modernism or even philosophy was a twinkle in humanity's eye, as early human populations moved into North America, extinctions, deforestation, change of land followed. Similarly, when the Maori arrived in New Zealand only 750 years ago, they caused many extinctions of species and vast deforestation of the southern island. They had, I presume, all the awe and wonder of nature, that closeness that we could imagine, but that did not prevent the failure of an ecological balance. So if this is, as I have argued, not only a quality of humanity, but of life itself, that flourishing leads to growth, which leads to unsustainability, then no metaphysic, whether my own or transcendental naturalism, will solve our climate foes or our climate woes unless we sort of face the dilemma head on. Do we choose flourishing or sustainability?
So thank you. I really appreciated this book and think it adds greatly to the many voices that are currently articulating some form of non-reductive materialism. For my own purposes, I cast a wide net and refer to these efforts under the umbrella of new materialisms. Not that there's anything necessarily new about them, but it's simply to distinguish it from the reductive productive materialisms that are at the center of many ecologically minded critiques of nature. I also appreciate the shout out in the introduction to the series I co-edit with Lisa Stenmark, Science and Religion as Critical Discourse, so thanks for that. And I thought it was cool that you quoted my childhood best friend, Benjamin Crow, in your book, so that was cool too. Okay, so Petersen's transcendental naturalism draws from an impressive list of resources, including mostly Latour, James, Sedaris, Rickert, Descola, and many voices involved in the science and religion discourse. Many of which you all are a part of. This integrative approach to doing scholarship is one that I am fully on board with and fully support. We need more voices within religion and science in order to keep the conversation fresh, relevant, and up to date. I also appreciate the critique of nature, God, and the unexamined certainties that hide behind those terms. And of course, I appreciate the attempt to rethink all things human within the rest of the evolving natural world as a collective, or nature cultures, or biohistories, or Gaia, or whatever other terms we might come up with to mark this from the perspective of self-professed moderns, reintegration of humans and the rest of the natural world. Finally, I'm sympathetic to the desire to extend science to multiple forms of science, not only the modern reductive and productive model. Most of what I have to say then is an effort to continue the conversation and create opportunities for productive conversation, creative differences. In terms of rethinking science beyond modern reductive and productive models, I'm wondering how someone like Dalia Nasser and her tracing of romantic empiricism in the 18th and 19th centuries might be helpful in dialogue with Petersen's discussion of transcendental naturalism. Nasser argues that many of the romantics studying nature were indeed materialists, but that the study of nature was a wondrous process of understanding beauty and truth. It was not at all merely about the reductive and productive process it became. Indeed, following her, I'd argue that the reductive and productive model of doing science is really a blip in the development of the sciences. Even up until the two world wars in the 20th century, there was not an agreed upon method for doing science. There were materialists, dualists, holists, and even pantheists and non-reductive materialists of some sort. Ernst Haeckel's understanding of a triune monism, for instance, was also an effort to understand the evolution of forms and feelings from the mineral to the plant, animal, and human worlds. It was really during the two world wars that science, and just the natural sciences, leaving behind the human sciences, became attached to technology transfer, weapons and chemicals, and then after to agricultural technologies and other fossil-fueled technologies of production, transportation, and communication. As Freya Matthews has argued, there was much more of an understanding within science that the scientific project was about encounters with, rather than knowledge of, solely knowledge of planetary others prior to this reductive and productive era. Another area of thinking that I wondered about was the immense body of literature around emergence theory, the science of how new levels and modes of life emerge in the process that cannot be reduced to the levels before them. It seems to me this is a model for thinking about science that doesn't so much call for a transcendental component, but relies on the open-ended process of entangled entities naturing again and again. Newness emerges as a result of this ongoing process, of entangled planetary evolution. I wonder what transcendental naturalism would have to say to emergence theory. The same can be said for process thought and other modes of pantheistic or panentheistic thinking, especially the work of Catherine Keller and her theopoetics that draws from older theologies of uncertainty, such as Nicholas of Cusa, as well as the uncertainty of certain interpretations of the quantum world. Finally, I wonder if there are productive differences to be found with other new materialisms, including my own version of critical planetary romanticism that relies on what I would call a viable agnosticism. Much like the late Michael Ruse, who Petersen mentions, I would argue that rather than filling uncertainty with everything, a full-blown theism, or nothing, a full-blown atheism, which are two sides of the same coin, the best stance toward thinking about how we might know the evolving planetary community is a stance that keeps the uncertainty open, hence a viable or livable agnosticism. I have a couple of final questions about the book, since it is, in the end, also addressing one of the most pressing planetary problems, human-caused climate change. First, what are the common grounds we can agree on, grounds, not foundations, from which we can stand to face uncertainty and to experience wonder at the rest of the natural world? There's a difference, of course, between thinking of language as a button or maintaining a viable agnosticism and fake news, alternative facts, and anything goes. I'm not saying that Petersen in any way advocates an anything goes approach, but it is important to think about the structures that might help us navigate between uncertainty and fake news and alternative facts, especially now. So what are structures that help us create the planetary public spaces necessary to have real conversations, create new ways of becoming, and new technologies that help us build different future worlds together? It's one thing to call for a type or model or method that assumes a transcendental naturalism or new materialism, but it's another to think about how to build the spaces necessary for such thinking. In many places, these spaces for thinking together in uncertain ways, in ways that might actually lead to a real conversation, the ability to be converted by the other, are retreating behind nationalisms, localisms, or doom and gloom, all of which involve a type of certainty of one's own perspective that eclipse the possibility for thinking in planetary rather than localistic or nationalistic ways. How can we begin to think together in a fast-paced fossil-fueled world, for instance, that barely enables the space to breathe? What spaces do we need to create that help us to slow down and think new ways forward? This gets at the politics of the matter that, to some extent, I wanted to see more of in the book: critical theories and the multiple embodied experiences of nature and climate change. Again, following De Scola and James, the book does touch on the pluriverse, or what I would call the need for understanding the co-construction of multiple worlds that link together at any given moment to make up what we might call the planetary. Yet I was looking for more insights from embodied theories of race, gender, sexuality, ability, decoloniality, and so on. It seems that if different bodies experience and know the world differently, a better understanding of the planetary community would be one that listened to as many voices and bodies as possible, human and non, in thinking about the planet. Much like a scatter plot chart, some voices would fall too far outside of the circle to integrate into a program for addressing, let's say, climate change. So we collect, as Latour might say, think about the technologies and worlds we need to co-create together and to address these problems, but then pay deep attention to those voices at the edges as they build up until, as Latour might argue, we have to collect again in new and different ways. For my own dealing with performativity and queer theory, I would argue that these abjected bodies and these voices are the remainders that make up the space of transcendence. They should not be made to fit into pre-existing models, but rather remain at the edges to haunt any world constructions that we might come up with from falling for the lure of certainty.
Perhaps it testifies to the richness of Arthur Petersen's book that it can be addressed from many different perspectives, because I will add, I think, another perspective to the ones we heard already, and I guess Lisa will do so as well after me. Climate, God, and uncertainty offers a unique contribution to the academic field of science and religion, and a very timely one at that. It is breaking new ground by arguing for a type of naturalism which attempts to overcome the limitations of existing forms, which may help us to be realistic about uncertainties, and which conveys an attitude of wonder and openness to what Petersen calls intimations of transcendence as elicited by the natural world. And the author really has an open mind, which enables him to incorporate widely divergent sources, for example, theistic ones, spiritual ones, agnostic ones, and atheistic ones, as long as these atheistic ones are not scientistic. I appreciate the perceptiveness of Petersen's criticism of scientism in regard to climate change. The way Petersen goes beyond traditional fault lines in debates about naturalism and religion is really refreshing, and his wish to be inclusive instead of divisive is, as far as I can tell from the book, very sincere. I have one main concern, though, with Petersen's discourse. In order to clarify where this comes from, let me reveal right away my own positionality. I consider myself a systematic theologian in the tradition of mainline Protestantism, so more or less like Bethany also said something like that. Whereas Petersen's work is decidedly from within the Kantian tradition, although Petersen criticizes Kant for keeping metaphysical assumptions in his philosophy, especially about the Dinge an sich. Petersen himself proceeds along the same lines very much to my mind. He also posits the real existence of a natural world, even though, of course, we cannot know that because it's beyond our experiences. But he argues that we have reason to do so as yet, like Kant did. So actually, he stays, in my view, very close to Kant. Do you say Kant or Kant, by the way? I'm Dutch, I'm not sure. Kant? Can we both ways? Yeah? Okay.
Can't say Kant.
Can't say Kant. Okay. So he stays very close to him. This is also palpable in the way he more or less tacitly assumes the validity of well-known Kantian dichotomies, like that between reason and faith, and even philosophy and metaphysics. Indeed, this notion of metaphysics is quite interesting here. Whereas analytical philosophers and theologians would typically see metaphysics as first philosophy, Petersen rather correlates metaphysics to religion, claiming that it requires faith that goes beyond reason, and characterizing metaphysics as, I quote, not belonging to theoretical philosophy, but being a matter of faith, end of quote. As a result, metaphysics is not a part of Wissenschaft, of academic work, academic disciplines either. That is, so I take it, metaphysics does not belong to the realm of knowledge. And here we stumble upon one of the most fundamental Kantian assumptions underlying this book. We cannot know what is beyond the realm of our sensory experience. Thus, I quote, God or the transcendent will go beyond philosophy proper, end of quote. Clearly, the notion of uncertainty that figures in the title of the book not only applies to the uncertainties related to climate change, but also applies to God, the central concept in the book's title. As a result of this firm Kantianism, theistic naturalist Petersen discusses a couple of theistic naturalists, for example, Fiona Ellis, Carl Peters, and Alistair McGrath. Theistic naturalists can be accommodated by Petersen only on one condition. It must be acknowledged that theism is a matter of faith beyond reason, not of knowledge. In fact, occasionally Petersen himself comes quite close to endorsing the theistic variety of naturalism, rather than an agnostic or a spiritual one. But then again, he avers, it should be, I quote, it should be clear, however, note strong language, it should be clear, however, that the specific metaphysical assumption made by these theistic naturalists cannot be demonstrated. Well, that seems fair enough, even though there's still a lot of work being done by analytical philosophers on arguments for and against the existence of God. But I'm concerned about the implicit dichotomy here. Since it cannot be demonstrated, it can apparently at best be a possibility, the truth value of which is uncertain. In brief, one cannot know that God exists, and theists can only get access into the transcendental naturalist boat if they accept this. At this point, I was reminded of a quite well-known paper by Petersen's fellow philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff, entitled, Is it possible and desirable for theologians to recover from Kant? It was published in a journal, I think deliberately so, in the journal Modern Theology by the end of the 90s, 1998 or so. And this paper starts with the story of a female theology student one day entering Wolterstorff's office and expressing a gratitude for Wolterstorff's book Divine Discourse, which had then just been published. You know what, she said to Wolterstorff, you just start talking about God as if nothing is wrong with that. What she had found so frustrating during her studies was that most modern theologians didn't allow her to speak about God, but required that she first shows that one can reasonably speak about God. And usually when they went through that exercise, they never recovered from it. The student and Wolterstorff discussed this point, and they agreed that Immanuel Kant had been, I quote, the decisive influence here. Wolterstorff therefore goes on to analyze Kant's thinking on this issue, pointing out that the metaphor of a boundary was of tremendous importance to Kant. Knowledge of God is unavailable to us since the transcendent lies beyond the boundary of what can be humanly known. Yet, there is another entryway into it, according to Kant, namely that of faith. It's this way of thinking, I surmise, that underlies Petersen's assessment throughout his book, and of course also those of Rickert in the line of Kant. Now, Wolterstorff is quite critical of this picture that has held us in its grip, as he says in a Wittgensteinian mode. This picture has even meant that a good many theologians, I quote Walterstorff now, a good many theologians have spoken far more confidently about the existence of the great boundary than about the existence of God. Walterstorff then points out an alternative epistemology, which he connects with the work of another philosopher, late 18th century philosopher next to Kant, Thomas Reid. Reid did not accept Kant's mental representationalism, according to which concepts are actually barriers between mind and reality. Reid suggests that the objects of our concepts are not mental states, but are real dogs, tables, etc. Of course, we can be wrong in that we don't actually see what we think we see or sense what we think we sense, but mostly we can trust that our perceptions serve as a link between our minds and reality rather than as a barrier. But if there is no structural boundary between me and the world, neither need to be one between me and God. Again, I may be wrong in my beliefs about God, but there is no a priori reason to think that I'm irrational or beyond reason in holding such beliefs. Now, let me finally point out the relevance of this point, because it's not, I'm not out to draw Petersen in the classical God debate here. But I think if Petersen would be willing to concede it, he would be able to include the vast majority of the adherents of the world's great monotheistic traditions in his proposal, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. No longer would they be forced to leave their claims to knowledge and rationality behind before entering the naturalist boat. Instead, he could join Petersen in his Latourian attempt at re-enchanting the world, experiencing the natural world as a place of wonder and mystery rather than taking it for granted. So I'm looking forward to Petersen's response here. On the one hand, I realize that I'm asking a lot, since my concern pertains to the most basic assumptions of Petersen's philosophical thinking in this book, and I suppose also beyond this book. On the other hand, I'm hopeful, since Petersen already distances himself from Latour's rejection of what Latour calls big transcendence. This transcendence as is being endorsed by within the great monotheistic religions. So Latour rejects that. Petersen is not so certain, and he does not reject that. He argues that both this notion and the one of mini transcendences preferred by Latour can be accepted. That is to say, they can be taken on faith, but they cannot be philosophically argued for or against. I quote. I hope that Petersen will open up to the view that it is definitely possible to argue philosophically both for and against notions of God and transcendence, so that such notions do not need to stay outside the house of rationality. Surely he can learn from many theistic naturalists, like I've mentioned Carl Peters and Fiona Ellis, but also Alistair McGrath, of course, whom he knows quite well, whose views on rationality, influence to the best explanation, etc., he discusses with much appreciation, though not yet with approval. So let's hope that that might change.
It's also like Bethany, I'm out of my zone of fluency and made my brain hurt a little bit even, I would say, but that's a good thing. It was nice to get back to thinking about people like William James, who I always loved and haven't thought about for a long time. Not so much Kant, really, but William James. So I'm very interested in wonder and how it functions in science and religion. So I'm going to zoom in on the question of wonder and the connection between wonder and, environmental engagement or action on climate change. So climate, God, and uncertainty presents an account of science as a practice that is open to wonder. On this account, as you've heard, values exist but are unreal in the sense of being ideal and are not mere creations of judgments. He writes, quote, it is the valuations in judgment that are real and uncertain and that determine which values get realized. Wonder, as he describes it, is a positive form of doubt, a creative type of uncertainty, pointing to or expressing an ineffable reality that science can't adequately model. Wonder is also sometimes expressed, following Latour, as a quality of, quote, remaining open to the dizzying otherness of existence. That's TENTS, existence, which I really like that definition of wonder. The book offers an account of transcendental naturalism that avoids scientistic naturalism on the one hand, as well as an unreflexive embrace of metaphysics on the other. Petersen develops a form of transcendental naturalism that is more open, although tentatively so, he says, than Latour's or William James, and open particularly to big metaphysical transcendence, to use James' term. A key claim, at least the one that I'm most interested in, is that transcendental naturalism can usefully address climate change and encourage climate action and environmental engagement. Petersen argues that wonder, quote, based in transcendental naturalism can be used philosophically to underpin ecological action in the context of climate change. So how might wonder do this, and for whom might it do this? There are a few suggestions throughout the book of where and how wonder as a kind of creative uncertainty or positive doubt might emerge or remain. The first hint we have regarding the place of wonder in transcendental naturalism comes in chapter 2, where Petersen discusses a passage from my own arguments about wonder from my book, Consecrating Science. So there I'm making a claim which I actually draw from Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park in their book, Wonders in the Order of Nature. The claim is that historically a shift has occurred such that wonder came to be a response to the puzzle solved rather than the puzzling phenomenon itself. So my claims about wonder are motivated in part by concerns about the inaccessibility of certain forms of wonder for the average person, for the non-scientist, for example. The kind of knowledge-based wonder that I critique is problematic not only because it is wonder about something, and as such, the wonder can easily dissipate as knowledge is gained, right? It sort of drains away. But also at issue in this dynamic is that non-scientists are then in a position of being informed by scientists what we should wonder at, when, and why. That is, we should wonder at the knowledge that science produces, the puzzle that has been solved, which might be quite elegant and beautiful. But even if we did not participate in the discovery or creation or whatever of that knowledge and cannot fully apprehend it. So this arrangement puts scientists in a priest-like role, handing down revelations of wonder that may only be fully interpreted and evaluated by the priests themselves. The larger implication is that mystery and uncertainty are drained away. The solution displaces the mystery as the thing at which we wonder. This, again, is just my own critique. So solutions can be elegant, beautiful, and surprising, but those features may not present themselves to the non-scientist. We just have to take their word for it. When they tell us something, not always, but often, if something is a beautiful, elegant solution to some problem in physics, I kind of have to assume that that's true because I don't understand it myself. So Petersen returns to my concern at the conclusion of chapter 2, and there he suggests, quote, that even if one thinks that one has solved an important piece of the puzzle, a feeling of mystery and uncertainty can remain, and I think that that's probably true. The remaining uncertainty has to do, as I understand him, with the inability of models to fully capture an underlying reality. But more than this, the experience of uncertainty can generate a kind of metaphysical transcendence, both small and sometimes big transcendence. But it's still a little bit unclear to me who has access to this transcendence that comes seemingly in or through science, since it often seems to depend upon a high degree of expertise. For example, when discussing Stephen Jay Gould or Alvin Plantinga's ideas about design, Gould doesn't think nature is designed, Plantinga does. It would seem that a certain depth of knowledge about biology, cells, or paleontology or geology is needed to experience the kind of wonder that Petersen describes. So in ways that echo some of my own inquiries into wonder, Petersen explores the question of whether a science-based myth that functions like a classical religious myth, either amending them or replacing them, can re-enchant the world. So this is the subject of a book that I wrote where I look at a lot of those attempts to sort of re-enchant the world by creating a new scientific myth. So I'm very invested in this question as well. Does poetics, he asked, provide an evolutionary epic? Similarly, he asked, quote, is it possible for poetry, fed largely by science, to bring re-enchantment of nature and motivate action against the ecological crisis? So there's that question again. This inquiry falls under the topic of poetics, which includes, but is broader than poetry, right? Poetics, he says, can trigger the experience of wonder. Models in science, which involve metaphor, thrive on poetic expression, he writes, and they advance science even though they are not taken literally. In the realm of religion as well, models can evoke religious responses. So there's a kind of, if I understand, a kind of big transcendence that's possible both through science and religion. A new hypothesis in science, for example, is similar to a mythos. He writes, quote, "The observation of new phenomena and the development of new techniques create intrigue. Until a hypothesis is validated, it retains this sort of mythic quality." Other examples of wonder-inspiring poetics are given in the book, drawing from Kepler and Copernicus, so ideas about celestial harmony and ellipses as having a kind of musical perfection. There's another phrase that I found very intriguing, which is the frightening poetics of Gaia, which makes me think that there is a sort of fearful dimension to this experience of wonder as well, as indeed it seems the moment that we are in. But again, it seems that many of these glimmerings of mythos might be available primarily to the practicing scientist, not always, but because it's the experience of science itself, I think, that's being described, or those who are directly engaged in hypothesis creation. And so I struggled at times to locate an account of how the average person might experience this wonder and thereby be more engaged in environmental action, which is, part of the point here, and I think we all would like to see more of that. So what often seems to be missing in these accounts of wonder is an element that one does find in Alistair McGrath's writing, namely a sort of an I-thou encounter, which of course goes back to Martin Buber. So Petersen quotes McGrath as arguing, quote, "We must encounter nature, not simply experience it. We must encounter nature, not simply experience it. That is, we need to treat nature as a thou, and in an unmediated way, where unmediated here means not mediated through scientific understanding." McGrath doesn't leave it there. He also believes that understanding can add to appreciation, and I think so too. I think that it can add to appreciation. Alongside a kind of virtuous form of ignorance that comes from the realization, this is McGrath, that nature points to something beyond itself, namely God or simply the unknown. So I agree with McGrath that this unmediated encounter, this confrontation with a thou, is a critical part of wonder. Petersen acknowledges the similarity between my own view and McGrath's, although he sees McGrath as taking the theistic route, whereas mine is, well, I think it's unclear. I think I don't commit exactly. But I'm not sure if he shares this view about the importance of this sort of, I-thou encounter with nature. It seems that without some such encounter, wonder is too narrowly circumscribed. It's also questionable whether the wonder and uncertainty experienced here has much to do with nature per se, as opposed to the workings of science. Even if our understanding of science isn't scientistic, and Petersen is careful to avoid that, there's still a kind of gap between what scientists experience and what others can access. Broader access to wonder is important for broader motivation on behalf of the environment. That, at least, is what the whole epic of evolution and other attempts, that sort of phenomenon, are trying to do, to sort of cultivate wonder so that people will act. One clear exception to these descriptions of wonder that seem sort of science-based or, rooted in the experience of practicing science appears at the end of chapter 6, and this is in the discussion about poetics. There, Petersen writes, quote, "In response to the scientific naturalistic approaches of ecological conservation observed by, that is, critiqued by Sedaris, i.e. me," he says, "I, Petersen, agree with Jane Goodall. The approach of Goodall he agrees with involves, quote, letting young people experience wonder in hands-on projects focused on real people and real animals in real environments." So I'm intrigued here by the turn to and the repeated use of the word real, which I take it is meant to contrast with abstract knowledge, which, as Petersen notes, may not do the trick, that's a quote, in inspiring wonder. Thus, as Goodall realizes, individual experiences and poetic references to them can help to motivate action. So I'm also curious as to why this hands-on experience in nature, which, by the way, is also the approach that my own book recommends, with extensive reference to Rachel Carson, who, like Jane Goodall, argued for this kind of direct encounter with nature. I'm curious why it seems limited to young people. Surely this is an avenue that is of wonder that is open potentially to people of all ages who are not in a position to grasp the details and the methodology of science and the room that it leaves for creative uncertainty. So those are my questions.
So thank you all for being here. Thank you panelists for your responses. And just to let you all know, the book I have, they're hard copies, they're softbound copies, but the beauty of the book is you can download it for free, right? I'm a big fan of open access, as many of you know, and that's also true for this book. So ever since I started sharing versions of this book for feedback, and the first 4th version was completed 5 years ago, I was most afraid of hearing that there would be major flaws in the systematic philosophical position that I had outlined and that I had labeled transcendental naturalism. That is a pretty open philosophical position that aims to move beyond both modernism and postmodernism to what one could call metamodernism. I didn't spell this out in the various versions of the book, but at least readers have not accused me of being too much of a modernist, and certainly not of being too much of a postmodernist. They have all sensed my desire to arrive at an integral philosophy that makes the most out of modernism through forcing some rigor into our thinking by using, in this case, transcendental philosophy, but an integral philosophy that immediately relativizes how far one can come with modernity, given the presence of plurality. So the meta-modern impulse sits in my desire to not just end on the one hand with, look at how beautifully this schema of everything in culture works, or on the other hand with everything is uncertain, so let's reflect more. But instead to put modern and postmodern tools to use in how we deal with climate change. So I've ended up with creating a philosophical monster, transcendental naturalism, that has unexpected bedfellows and that not many people comfortably get their arms around. And I do realize it makes for some heavy reading. Josh calls my philosophical position sophisticated. Bethany refers to it being a deep dive into philosophy across several centuries, across several intellectual traditions. Whitney also refers to it as being based on an impressive list of resources. And Gijsbert says that I incorporate widely divergent sources. And then Lisa just said that it made her brain hurt a little bit. I'm extremely appreciative of all my respondents having invested the time and mental energy to engage with the book, especially those who don't see themselves engaged in philosophy. So your responses are really helping me with the new and cool projects that I am presently working on following up on the book, and I will tell you how. So let me say up front, as I indicated, I'm relieved that also in this case, nobody has said that my philosophical position is plain wrong, which would have been in anyone's right. And I'm sure there are plenty of philosophers out there who would love to do just that. Well, thanks for the charity here. Indeed, I'm pleased to see that the pattern that I have experienced over the past 5 years is continuing. What has continually happened is that readers have said, all nice and well with this transcendental naturalism of yours, but can you please say more about X, Y, and Z? So, while the responses I received on the first versions were along the line, can you please say more about the sources? James, Rickert, especially Latour. This time around, for the final version, I hear, can you please say more about the consequences? So I take the responses to be inviting me to say more about how transcendental naturalism plays out for science and nature, in the case of Josh, worldviews and sustainability, in the case of Bethany, emergence and critical theories, Whitney, theory and God, Gijsbert, and wonder and nature, Lisa. So let me briefly summarize each of the responses, then address them in turn, and I will promise to stay in the 20 minutes. So Josh challenges the need to expand the concept of nature and include transcendental values in it too. So I need to say something more about my understanding of science, and also to clarify whom I think my meta-modern position is benefiting and how. So my short answer to him is, yes, such an expansion of the concept of nature is warranted, but natural scientists can just stick with a modernist position to do their science, including using a modern notion of nature that does not include values. Bethany doesn't see the power of philosophy. Whether we overcome the modernism, postmodernism debate through transcendental naturalism, changing one's worldviews won't make the world more sustainable. For instance, by countering humans' attempts to control. So I need to say more about worldviews, about climate policy. And my short answer to her is, yes, worldviews do matter in reaching sustainability, but transcendental naturalism by itself doesn't have much power. It only describes how worldviews are plural. Whitney asks about the links between transcendental naturalism and emergence theory on the one hand, and critical theories on the other hand. So I need to say more about those. And my short answer to him is, yes, the links to emergence and critical theories are there, but they were largely left implicit. And Gijsbert is afraid that I, following Kant, say that it is not possible to theorize about God, and hence that transcendental naturalism is not accessible to theists. So I need to say something that alleviates Gijsbert's FOMO, fear of missing out. And my short answer to him is, yes, also theists can, in my terminology, can toggle to a meta-modern perspective like transcendental naturalism, maybe not as easily as agnostics. But most of them, theists, must recognize that they are essentially adhering to a pre-modern philosophy or a non-Kantian modern philosophy that negates postmodernism. Making a strong claim here, I know. And I don't mean this in any way pejoratively. It's just a description of most theists. Lisa points out that the way the book engages with wonder is skewed towards wonder in science, including where I discuss poetics and nature conservation. So I need to say more about non-scientific wonder. And my short answer to her is, yes, you're right. I only hinted at it that Latour's plea for building a ritual around Gaia may suffer from exactly the same problem as the one that you have identified more generally for mytho-poeticized science. Now, for my further replies to each of you. So Josh, let me start with Josh's concerns about science and nature. So he challenges me for making a metaphysical proposal by following Latour in expanding the concept of nature to be equivalent with the world. And by following Rickert to even include ideal values in it, touché. Of course. I'm not embarrassed to have staked a claim in the everlasting discussion on what we mean by nature. Also in this conference, it was very clear that anything goes there. But given my carefulness in trying to do as much philosophy as I can on this side, as distinct from all the other sides, that is through metaphysics, this comment made me think about what I've actually been doing here. So my first hunch that what we are dealing with is just terminological squabble. With Latour, I've just polemically defined nature to stand for the world, and it includes everything on this side. So referring to the whole experienceable world, which means also including meaning and value by using the word nature, is not a metaphysical move. But I'm afraid such a cop-out won't satisfy Josh. So he can still make the point that they give values a separate ontological status. So in their ideality, I do say that they exist, but note I'm careful to nowhere in the book call values real. Again, that would be terminological squabble to challenge Josh on this one. So the heart of the matter is that Josh rightfully points out that with my expansion of the concept of nature, I'll be losing practicing scientists from my audience. If I just wouldn't do that and point to Kuhn for paradigm, Scruton for cognitive dualism, then I could also make my point that values are an inherent part of scientific judgment, with values being part of human nature. Well, no need to go further than this. I agree in the initial training of scientists, and I agree with Josh that the discussion on the ontological status of values may act as a distraction in getting scientists to understand the role of values in their practices. But then scientists will continue to react in the same way as I witnessed the scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to react when they were told that Mother Earth was missing in their report. They were as deer in the headlights. And one of my present projects is to integrate transcendental naturalism and metamodernism in the new BSc program that we're running at UCL on science and engineering for social change. If we want scientists to be able to interact more productively with non-modern cultures, well, I know this is never going to be smooth, they will need some deeper humanities training than they're currently receiving. Then Bethany. Let me move on to Bethany's concern about the influence of worldviews on sustainability. Start with glass half empty, glass half full, pessimism, optimism. I think Bethany's more of the former in terms of her worldview. I'm more of the latter. But that doesn't help you much. So let me clarify what my book does with worldviews. It highlights their centrality in human lives, their associated metaphysical commitments, but also their bringing together of so much more than just theory, which metaphysics is. I agree with her, which is why I largely stay away from it in the book. That is, it also includes ethics, politics, religion, art, etc. So transcendental naturalism offers a theory of worldviews, a Weltanschauungslehre, which is what a philosophy of culture or philosophy of value is supposed to do. I'm afraid, in the book, I don't offer much by way of solving the problem of climate change. I just use this problem as a cue to further complexify philosophy. But such a cop-out won't satisfy Bethany. So climate is the first word of the title of my book, and I've been working most of my working life on dealing with the problem of climate change, both from academia, the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, and at the interface between science, taken as Wissenschaft, and policy. Be it in the Netherlands, where I made my career in the Dutch government, and am now back as the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Dutch Delta Commissioner, or in the UN's IPCC. So let me highlight then my efforts over the past 2 decades to make a broad notion of worldviews that includes views on how we need to run our societies, make it central to the way policy analysis gets done. I've documented this in a range of articles, starting with a seminal one in the journal Ecological Economics in 2009, together with Bert de Vries, which underlies his CUP textbook on sustainability science. Now, I'm not pretending that the numerous sustainability assessments that use this kind of tool to talk about worldviews, to assess policy options, have been that they have been produced and then were able to turn the ship around. But I'm confident that in the end, that's my optimism, with the tragic help from quite a few more climate disasters in the next few decades, they will. So we do need your theology there. I disagree with Bethany that human flourishing is always irreconcilable with sustainability, but she rightfully indicates that the path to get there will be narrow, and also that it will involve a huge amount of suffering along the way. So I will be working on exactly this question in my new research program on the future of the Nile River Basin, where I will apply transcendental naturalism in a whole host of disciplines. The 11 states of the Nile River Basin face a variable and changing climate and the continuous increase of their demand for use of the Nile, and they are internationally in conflict and internally highly centralized, non-democratic, and subject to civil strife. Now, my claim, drawing on transcendental naturalism, is that environmental policy analysis, which is then the discipline I highlight here, has not sufficiently addressed the relevant cross-cultural dimensions and attendant uncertainties. So I know it won't be easy, but I will keep dreaming of that part of Africa flourishing sustainably and showing through the use of models how it may actually be possible. So I'm very happy to be considered naive here by Bethany, and I will continue with it regardless, with hope. Okay, Whitney. Over to Whitney. He claims that emergence theory is useful to set a larger scene. I agree. And asks himself how that could be connected with transcendental naturalism. Furthermore, he sees too little critical theory in the book. I again agree. And challenges me to address more of the politics of the matter head-on and in a critical and embodied fashion. I did not include this in the book, but I will include it in my teaching using the book and further philosophical research building on the book. So I intend to outline a meta-modern perspective on complexity and emergence, with ultimately meta-modernism, or what you can call the meta-modern code, with transcendental naturalism as its epistemological underpinning, emerging out of the postmodern code, arising out of the modern code, arising out of the pre-modern code, arising out of the indigenous code, etc. And in the grander scheme of nature, culture arising out of mind, arising out of life, arising out of matter. So Whitney invites me to come along with him and the late Michael Roos, who we so sorely now miss, and choose the agnostic position. But I don't think that philosophically I'm required to commit to such a metaphysical step, however much I respect it and can see the beauty of it. I say philosophically here on purpose in the sense that the neo-Kantians, whom I follow here, saw philosophy as Wissenschaft, distinguishing it from metaphysics and theology. But don't worry too much, Gijsbert, I will come to you in a second. I may mellow a little bit. So 2 other fields that at least Rickert didn't count as Wissenschaft. I am very much prepared to entertain a more open and tolerant approach to what counts as Wissenschaft. I have no political purposes to exclude any field in which critical reflection among a community of scholars takes place in the university. This book maybe just constituted my prolegomena, to enable me and others to always be clear for themselves where in the world they sit ontologically with their different activities and how uncertainty plays out there, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, and within that latter category, ontology and epistemology. But there's so much space to still be explored. So I thank Whitney for his invitation, specifically on critical theories. I'm developing a new third-year undergraduate course on science engineering as cultures, which will largely focus on postmodern critical theories to analyze how science engineering are contextual, political, and toggling out of those theories at set points to reach back to the meta-modern perspective, including transcendental naturalism, to then dive back in again. I will make sure to document and reflect on the experience. Now, Gijsbert, on theory and God, I admit that I would have to study more of Thomas Reid in order to respond fully to what Gijsbert brings out against the Kantian approach. And I'm actually going to do that at some point. That is, that concepts do not constitute structural barriers between mind and reality, as Kant seems to have it. And the flip side of Gijsbert's argument here is that, as he states, we can trust that our perceptions serve as a link between our minds and reality. In my book, I observe about what I think is a very similar interpretation of Kant by James, that A, such an interpretation is only one possible interpretation, albeit the dominant one in the English-speaking world, and that B, Rickert offers his pro-physics as an innovative solution to the problem observed. So I argue, and I quote from my book's crucial page 64, I don't know why that number, but that's the page, that Rickert, like James, finds a middle ground where, in a way structurally similar to how James positions its pure experience, vis-a-vis thought and thing, reality and validity are transcendentally assumed, but not yet separated, in the meaning that is bestowed in the act of a valuing judgment. Now, I won't bore us all to death further parsing Rickert's theory of pro-physics, or as it also could be called a theory of the pro-perceptual. But I do believe that transcendental naturalism features an extreme openness to different metaphysical positions, including that of theism. And yes, metaphysics does not need to sit in philosophy's doghouse. I'm willing to loosen my use of the term philosophy to include metaphysics, and yes, one can absolutely and must definitely theorize about God and be considered rational in doing that. However, I do maintain, with Rickert, that religion is essentially and foremost an atheoretical activity that crosses with theory in its use of metaphysics. And let me put it in careful terms. I doubt that metaphysics can reach the levels of certainty that some other parts of philosophy may be able to reach. Okay. But in the end, we remain uncertain on every front. That's good enough for me. As I alluded to in my first short response to Gijsbert, I think that one really has to go through postmodernism to fully get what I'm aiming at with transcendental naturalism. And this may be too difficult to stomach for some. So I think the meta-modern perspective can make one less fearful of the postmodern perspective. Then Lisa, Wonder in Nature. I was so impressed when James Goodall came to a workshop I co-organized in Groningen in the lead up to the Johannesburg Summit in 2002. And with her contribution to the volume that I subsequently co-edited. And indeed, in terms of the quotation, I don't think it's just limited to the young, just to add that. So we absolutely need the personal experience of wonder at nature in hands-on settings that, like the Poetics of Rachel Carson, is much more powerful than science with some poetry added. I do admit this aspect of wonder has been snowed under in my book by my in-depth analysis of the role of wonder in science, complemented by a relatively shallow analysis of the role of wonder in religious ritual. So for me, the question of wonder is central to the openness to uncertainty. In the context of analyzing a broader access to wonder than through science as being important, as Lisa states, for broader motivation on behalf of the environment, I'd say we can use the different values that Latour distinguishes and indicate what uncertainty is at stake. So for reproduction, we wonder whether what we hold dear, to which we may relate to in an I-thou encounter, whether that can continue to exist. For metamorphosis, We wonder whether we let ourselves be lured out of our individual and collective psychosis. For habit, we wonder whether we can actually move towards more sustainable courses of action and then attend to them. For technology, we wonder what is and isn't possible, realizing full well the limitations and risks of new technologies. For fiction, we wonder how stories about the future, both positive and negative and neither of both, how stories hold up, and whether we can relate to the fictional nature cultures offered. For reference, we wonder how scientific models will pan out. For politics, we wonder how majority groups can be formed that attack sustainability issues. For law, we wonder how in future nature will be represented. For religion, we wonder what it means in the present world to be saved. For attachment, we wonder about what we really hold dear. For organization, we wonder how we get ourselves going and on track. For rules and institutions. For morality, we wonder how we weigh costs and benefits in the context of inequity. For network, we wonder how everything is connected with everything, etc., etc. That final one is for preposition. These are technical terms from Latour, and I advise you to have a look. For preposition, we wonder how we can toggle in and out of transcendental naturalism and the different modes of existence. What I meant to say, none of these 14 modes of wonder require any specialization. They're all accessible to everyone with a little bit of practice. I'm not saying that this solves the problem. I'm just highlighting what we can wonder about. So with this, I conclude my responses, and I again wish to thank everyone here for attending this session.